Hi, this is going to be the review, and as well there's some new material here for the exam that we're going to have coming up. I'll post this PowerPoint as well online so you'll have access to these pictures, but I'm doing a screen recording so that you can actually see what I'm seeing as I talk about this. So in this chapter, what we're talking about is jazz and radio, but to understand that, to give that context, we need to talk about a precursor to radio, which was records. And if you read in that chapter, it's chapter 4 on jazz and radio, she talks quite a bit in comparing radio and records. The record player of the time, although record players were developing dramatically over this time, the record player just before radio is introduced, and while radio is in its heyday in the 20s and 30s, the record player of its time was the Victrola or the gramophone. So there are important things, important aspects about this, just to make sure we're all on the same page, because they make it really clear what's different between records and radio. First, these machines that played records were non-electric. They did not use electricity. They were mechanical devices. You cranked them to wind up a spring, and that's what caused the turntable to turn. It had a little governor, a kind of a mechanism to keep that turning at a roughly the correct revolutions per minute. 78 RPMs became an established standard. The needle on the end of the tone arm was actually a spike. It was nothing more than a spike. There were no wires. There was no amplification done electrically. That spike was connected to a diaphragm that essentially acted as the speaker cone, which was then, the sound would then wind out through the hollow tone arm and then out through a big giant kind of for various models in various ways, would wind out through a big giant horn. But that was all mechanical. That was the actual needle scratching on the record, creating vibrations that were being pumped out through the speaker horn. No electrical amplification whatsoever. Likewise, early on, recording records was done entirely mechanically as well. Basically kind of like a Victrola in reverse, where a Victrola-like machine, not exactly, but like one, was set up in a recording studio. Musicians would play their hearts out into the open horn of this object, this recording device, which would then cause a needle to scratch on a blank record. It was a special device and a special record, but the gist of it was a mechanical means of recording. Terribly important to understand, tape recording does not come into play at all until after World War I. Tape recording was developed and then became basically the sole object of and technology of Germany, our enemy, during World War II. So it was only after World War II that we and everybody else gets access to a much higher fidelity form of recording that involves magnetized flexible tape and all the electrical components. So this is long before magnetic tape recording. Terribly important to note, this is straight from the book. Let me read it. The ordinary record is a poor imitation of the human voice. Practically all of them give a very disagreeable scratchy noise, and even when they don't, the enunciation is seldom distinct enough for one to understand the words of a song, for example, unless it is repeated many times. This is a quote from a long time ago, kind of a review of the technology of records at that time. Note this, I have it underlined. Radio, because of its superior amplification process and its use of microphones, eliminated such nuisances. So that's key. Radio, while radio and records early on in the 20s and 30s were, in a sense, competing technologies, radio was actually far more advanced than record players were at the time for in a number of ways, and that's one of the points that you need to understand, because a number of questions are about comparing radio with record players. Now there is a little bit more here. It says, and while the quality of music as heard on crystal sets, those are the very earliest form of do-it-yourself radios, couldn't compare with that on a phonographic record, the new supraheterodyne tube set produced sound superior to that of the talking machine. So very, very first radios, homemade, do-it-yourself things, we called them crystal sets. They weren't as good as gramophones and Victrolas. But very early on, right away, once the tube radio sets that were mass-produced by RCA and other companies came available, those were far superior to what they're calling the talking machine, which were basically Victrolas and gramophones. This is key to getting the exam right here, is that radio was far superior to records at that point. Here's a list of how they were different. So first, I'm going to talk about records not in their positive aspects, because there were some wonderful things about records. It was a miraculous invention. But once radio came online, records paled. Records were lo-fi. I say lo-fi meaning low fidelity. They didn't have any bass to them, neither in the recording aspect or in the reproduction in the speaker aspect. It was all mechanical, remember? And also the high end was not good. There was not a lot of high fidelity. And also, there wasn't a lot of dynamic range. And also, records would scratch from the moment you bought them. It was nearly impossible not to scratch them. Point two, records were expensive. The average family probably could afford to own no more than a dozen records. That was it. And by the way, one record, and that goes to point three, one record could probably hold one song on a side, 3 minutes per side. So you're looking at, because they're 78s, there's a short playing time in record. On the other hand, radio was all electrical right from the beginning. Radio, by its very definition, was electronic. It was mid-fi or mid-fidelity, so it was clear. It had a bit more dynamic range. It certainly had more frequency response, and you might get static if there was poor reception. But in general, if your reception was okay, it was much clearer. Secondly, it was free after you purchased the radio. So radio broadcasts were free. You received them free. And thirdly, radio was constantly playing new material. And this is an important point to understand. In the day of radio, in the golden era of radio, records were not typically played regularly on the radio. And the reason is because of this technical issue. The records were actually poorer quality than what you could get from a live broadcast. And secondly, because of business models and the peculiarities of the time that were sorting things out, it wasn't, the mechanisms were not clearly in place for easily playing records legally on the radio. So the result is to understand, during this golden era, the 20s, the 30s, most all radio music was live. What that meant was that there was every day, every broadcast day, meant there were a long list of performers waiting in the hallway to come one by one before the microphone, where they would then perform. What this meant is that they were live performances that were lively and vibrant and full of energy, and they also were supremely good quality because it was just the performance directly into the mic coming out through the speaker of the radio. So radio at that time was advanced much more and was a higher quality experience than records. Just a few pictures here. Now, here's another part in the exam I want you to pay attention in her writing. Find this in her writing so that you can understand this. She writes, and this is a quote from her writing, that radio had the ability to create a vast army of music lovers in America. That's very important. Prior to radio, there was not, American general populace was not dipped in music all the time. Radio changed that dramatically. This is a very important part, and there's actually a question or two in the exam about this, radio's influence. So this goes into more depth. Here's an example from here's a quote from the book, and made music a more integral structuring part of everyday life and individual identity. Through radio, millions of people now established new musical cultures. So look at these 4 points. 1, radio made music a more integral structuring part of everyday life. 2, and this is literally from the exam, it structured social relations much more thoroughly and ubiquitously. That means that people shared a common culture. In any one location, there was probably not more than one dominant radio station for many years. And that meant that radio station, the experience of the music and the people and the personalities on that station were common to everybody that was a radio listener, which was pretty much everybody. So that brings me to the third point, the commonality of the experience. And finally, people's emotional sense of time, place, and history became unified and defined by the radio. At 8 o'clock on a Friday, everybody that was listening to the radio, which was practically everybody, was listening to exactly the same thing. When they got to work on Monday morning, they had heard the same shows, shared the same experiences. That's what she means by structuring social relations. Here's another point that's in the exam. She talks a great deal about radio and men, and really look at this in the reading. Point 1, by linking technical mastery with music listening, it made the enjoyment of music by men legitimate. Prior to radio, men, frankly, were not allowed to enjoy music in the same way. Except for professional musicians and composers, it was unmanly to be focused so much on music. This is a very strange and foreign notion to us now. And point 2, it was a way for men to indulge in their emotions. And this can't be emphasized enough, how radio just opened up the avenues for men to experience and sort of relish in emotions. And remember, the music of the time, jazz, was about love and about passion and about fun and lots of other stuff like that. This was quite a revelation for your average man. Now, in detail here, and these are details that are in the exam, I want you to find this part of the reading and pay attention to this, and look what I've underlined here. Instruments that produced musical tones of either high or very low frequencies. Now we're talking here about orchestras, violins and oboes on one end, cellos on the other, were scarcely heard on the radio. Even though radio was higher fidelity, it was mid-fi. So radio was not kind to orchestral music. Whereas other instruments, the instruments of jazz, the piano, the clarinet, the saxophone, they came across especially well given radio's early lack of fidelity. I call it mid-fi. Here, jazz would have a distinct advantage on the radio. So the point here is now comparing classical music and jazz as kind of competing musical forms. Which one was going to be dominant on radio? And this is important because classical music was by the white kind of ownership of radio stations and stuff. It was presumed to be that it would be the dominant form of music. Jazz was disruptive, it was chaotic, it was frightening. And yet, even we've already talked about how jazz was so much more addictive and so much more thrilling. It also was a knockout fit with radio, and orchestral music was not. So we've discovered already orchestral music is at a disadvantage because of their instruments, and jazz is at an advantage because of their instruments. Jazz instruments, and remember to memorize this, piano, clarinet, saxophone, they came across especially well on radio's mid-fi sort of mechanism. Also singers, this is another question on the exam. Singing changed. The kind of operatic, powerful, ear-splitting singing that works in a concert hall with an orchestra, a classical orchestra, was no good at all on radio. It would blow out the tubes. And so right away, jazz, which was able to be adaptable, was able to kind of reinvent its singing style to include more of a crooning style. Eventually, crooning would develop, which is a kind of a softer way of singing. So that's really important for you to note as well. So here's a couple of points. Radio favored the mid-range instruments of jazz, piano, clarinet, saxophone. And likewise, radio disadvantaged the instruments of classical orchestra music, violins, oboes, and cellos. But the other thing is that jazz was by its nature improvisational, right? Jazz could be written down, but usually jazz tunes were songs where you knew the chord changes and you might know the melody and the words, but you loosely played with them. That was expected. Jazz was improvisational. So that meant that jazz, when it started early on playing on the radio, jazz greats like Louis Armstrong could say, hey, turns out we can't hear a trap drum set, but so let's replace that with a banjo, a strumming banjo. And as it turns out, there's a whole era in early hot jazz where the rhythm is kept by a strummed banjo primarily, because it was more friendly to the actual technology of the time. So whereas classical music, you didn't reorchestrate or rewrite classical music. It just wasn't done that much. So classical music was stuck with what it had. Another advantage of jazz. This is Vonda Leith. She was one of the first earliest sort of soft singers, jazz soft singers, initiated, creating the crooning. Now, another question on the exam has to do with jazz and how it affected the kind of youth culture of the time. And she talks about jazz occurring in the late 1800s and then into the early 1900s, which was right at sort of the tail end of Victorian culture. And jazz rubs up against Victorian culture. One of the things you're going to get as a question in the exam has to do with ironies. Ironies of jazz on the radio. So one way of very simply expressing an irony is to say this on one hand, while that on the other. And those two things are dissimilar, and it turns out it's ironic. So the first two are pretty easy. On one hand, you have, this is music from an oppressed group of people, former slaves, people living under Jim Crow laws, black oppression. While at the same time, this music, especially during the 20s, fueled the first huge white youth rebellion. You know, the first youth cultures appear in the 1920s. These are young white kids, middle class and upper class, who are drinking illegally, who are smoking marijuana, who are driving fast cars, who are thumbing their nose at their parents, and they're all doing this. They're having this burst of freedom using the music produced by an oppressed culture. It's ironic. Second, the irony of black music production, because most of the great musicians early on were black, versus the white ownership of that music production, the white radio operators, the white record label owners. Sad and ironic. The third is the most interesting and tricky. is that while radio was a space-age technology for its time, it used electricity, it worked with wireless waves going through the air, the music that really rode on radio and that really propelled radio was a music tradition that, in a good sense, was pre-literate, meaning, well, jazz was not necessarily written down, it was rather an oral tradition. And also, it had a kind of propulsiveness and appealed to the senses in a way that brought us back to an early, more authentic sense of ourselves. Pejoratively, people would call it sometimes jungle music or something, but in a way, it was a kind of a return to the body and a return to a sort of an instinctual joy. Okay, so that's an overview of that part. Now, if you go into Blackboard, you can see right here is our study guide for exam. And so you can open this up just as I am. And oops, says access denied. Let's see if I can reset this here. Sorry. I'm going to, sorry, this was a little bit of a glitch. Blackboard, here we go. All right. Log in. We'll get into that page. Here we go. History of electronic media. And what we're going to do is look at this study guide. So remember, here's our content page, and the study guide is located under Module 1, right? So here's Module 1, Jazz and Radio, and then the study guide will appear at the top right here. Boom. So you can look at this as well to get this. So here's the first question. And these are taken pretty much from the exam, although reworded a bit. Just make sure that you understand these questions. You can't memorize these because I've reworded them in the exam so that if you just memorize them, they won't serve you. In fact, you'll get tricked up. So what were the specific factors in the success of jazz on the radio? Well, it turns out jazz was the instrumentation was more suitable for radio, that jazz was improvisational, which meant it could adapt to the radio. So those are two biggies. Next one, how does this chapter say radio affected the general population? So the key here is what I said earlier, is that radio structured social relations. Something to look into. Next one, what business is the most direct precursor to radio? Well, you could say, if you have a choice, you could say that record players are the precursor to radio. If you don't have record players as a choice, then the next choice is, if you have sheet music as a choice, sheet music is the direct precursor to radio. So it depends on what your choices are. Next one, what were the advantages of radio over early records? Well, so we just said it earlier. Radio was higher fidelity. It was mid-fi instead of lo-fi. Radio was free. All the music was free once you bought the box. Broadcasts were free. You could have an infinite amount of music because you were getting it all live. You didn't have to buy records, and it was a long-form play. Meaning you didn't have to go up and change records constantly. It would go on and on. What are three ironies concerning jazz and early radio? So we just said those three, right? One is black oppression versus white youth rebellion. That's one. Second one was black production or black musicians versus white owners or producers. And then the third one was space age technology versus a pre-literate music form. Beyond entertaining, next one, beyond entertaining them, what does Susan Douglas emphasize as something radio offered men? And she suggests there, and this is really beautiful to read about, she says that radio allowed men to indulge in their emotions. Next one, what three instruments are mentioned as coming across especially well given radio's lack of fidelity? Well, that would be clarinet, saxophone, and piano, the instruments that were dominant in jazz. Next one. Because of the sensitivity and limitations of microphones for radio, what aspect of music style changed or adapted? And that was singing changed. Singing went from that kind of operatic bel canto style to what later became what we now know as crooning, a softer form of singing. Next one. What emotions are mentioned as involved in white America's relationship to minstrelsy? Now, I haven't talked about that here in this screencast, but I did talk about it earlier on in other lectures. It's important to look back in your notes to look at love and loathing, that America's relationship, especially white America's relationship to minstrelsy, was both loving it and loathing it. And it's a key phrase that makes a lot of sense. You'll actually see that in the exam. Next, what were the disadvantages classical music had over jazz over the radio? Well, classical music instrumentation was not, violins and violas and cellos were not audible over the radio. Classical music couldn't adapt its instrumentation because it was sort of fixed in its compositions. So those were two. Which factor most contributed to white America's enthusiasm for a unique new music? You know what? That's not even on the exam, so I'm just going to pass over that one. Next one. It is most apt to say that jazz in the 20s spoke to the rebelliousness against, and the answer here is Victorian values. In the 20s, although we had moved a bit up beyond Victorian era, that rebellious spirit directly sort of ran crosswise with Victorian era values of parents and older people. What device takes the human voice and any other sound and turns that embodied communication into an electrical signal? And the answer is there is the microphone. That's the magic of the microphone. Next, what form of electrical wired communication preceded telephony? So electrical, wired communication. So that would be telegraphy, right? Telephony is telephone, is embodied, but electrical wired before telephone, that would be telegraph. Next one, which developer virtually monopolized the first era of wireless telegraphy in the United States? Well, that's almost an EMF 140 question, but it is Guglielmo Marconi. Marconi is the guy who dominated wireless telegraphy. Let me see if I can get this to show up here. Hang on one second. I'm going to go back and open this page up in a new tab so that I can see all the way down to the bottom here. Pardon me for 1 second. Open in a new tab. That'll allow me to see this. There we go. Wired telegraphy is what form of communication? Wired telegraphy is what form of communication? And we can say that it is an encoded form of communication, right? Telegraphy uses dots and dashes, and so we can say that this is an encoded form of communication rather than embodied. What form is broadcast radio? We can say that broadcast radio is embodied communication. Nobody listens to dots and dashes on broadcast radio. They listen to voices and music and sound effects and so on. And finally, what device turns electrical signals into embodied sound? And the answer is a speaker. You take an electric signal, you pass it through this device, you hear it as embodied sound. That would be a speaker. So this is a review for the exam. Remember, come to the basement of the library. It's 2 stories, 2 flights down from the main entrance of the library, and go into the computer lab, find a seat, sit down, log into Blackboard, into your Blackboard, and then you should see exam number 1, Jazz and Radio, available for you to take. And if all of the workstations are filled, just wait. They'll become available. I'll be there. I'll be sitting at one of the desks, kind of keeping an eye on everything, making sure that this will work out for you, okay? So And we won't start the exam until our class time period starts, which is 11 o'clock. So I look forward to seeing you. I hope the weather holds up. Everything does well. Thanks again.